Okay, so this is the session on how competitive broadband, welcome Kate, hey. How competitive broadband, the benefits of broadband competition is the short version. I'm Robert Pepper at the Aspen Institute. We have a great panel. The bios are in here, so I'm not going to, go through biographical introductions. There's always a lot of talk about, the benefits of competition and focusing on things like, price, but there's a lot more, and there's a whole set of issues about really broadband as a way for people to access the internet. There are questions about what is broadband, and it's really about, as the title says, a lever for progress. The way we've structured this afternoon's session is Blair Levin is going to sort of give us a scene-setting framework, laying out his ideas. Blair, of course, led the National Broadband Plan effort at the FCC, is leading the GigU effort, is an advisor to the investment community, and has also been advising governments globally on broadband, what it means, what the benefits are, how do you get it. We then have 4 different panelists who are going to provide their reflections from their perspectives on what Blair said, but also from their own experiences. And then what I'd like to do is really open it up and have a much more interactive conversation with the people in the room, because you're all experts on broadband and the benefits that you've seen as well. So with that, I'm going to, turn it over to Blair. Go ahead.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you all for being here. So I'm going to try to create a framework based on a bunch of the experiences we had with the broadband plan and some of the things that have happened since then. But I guess I should start by confessing that I don't have a Pokemon Go joke, which I think is pretty much required for things like this. And so I want to go back a couple weeks, so last Tuesday, and talk about Brexit, because I happened to be in London during that week actually talking to investment firms, and it was like totally fascinating. But one of the things that I did not pick up from the United States that I very much picked up there was it was really quite extraordinary the extent to which in the campaign a certain side was able to state certain things that make no sense, and yet somehow they got away with it because they were able to say things like, we can leave the EU, we'll save 350 million pounds, a week, and we'll spend it all on national health services, but we'll still get the same deal from the EU. And of course, one of the fascinating things about being in London that Friday and Saturday was within 48 hours, they were all walking all that stuff back. But what really demonstrated was like during the campaign, they were really never challenged on it. And the reason I say that is it reminds me of a lot of conversations I have about competition, or I've had over the last 10 years in the United States, where people make certain assertions, and it's very easy to state aspirations. It's very easy to ignore trade-offs. But that's what I hope we're able to do here. And so what I want to do is focus on what I think of are the 3 questions anyone who talks about competition ought to answer. I'll give you my answer. Might be a good answer, might be a bad answer, but it's based on my experience. And then we can hopefully ask better questions and give better answers. So my 3 questions are, what do we want it to accomplish? Where does it come from? Where does competition come from? And given the current market, what are appropriate government levers to intensify competition? My short answer to the first one is what we want broadband competition to accomplish. And as Bob said, there are lots of different things that we want competition to accomplish. The one that most people focus on is lower prices, which to me is almost never the thing we really want it to do, for reasons that we could go into, but I would just note, I'd rather just kind of blow up markets and provide, really disruptive things, but prices are actually not at the heart of it. But it's things like speed, it's latency, it's cybersecurity, it's a bunch of how do you bundle it and create different kinds of products. But the big point from my perspective is we want bandwidth never to be a constraint on economic growth and social progress. And what that requires is some kind of concept of affordable, abundant bandwidth. And then we ask the question, where does it come from? Now, this is where I actually disagree with some of my good friends, because in my looking at it, it seems to me there are basically four different entities it can come from. It can come from existing players in a market. It can come from greenfield new entrants. It can come from adjacent market entrants, and it can come from resale entrants. So those are the types of enterprises. It also, and this is often ignored, comes from certain things in the economy. That is to say, intensified competition always requires a new capital allocation by one of those four kinds of enterprises. Second, that decision inevitably follows a change, either in the market or in technology or in some other thing, which I'll mention in a second, that lowers the cost of deployment, including risk, and increases revenues or competitive risk. And third, that what history would suggest is in communications networks, that almost always follows a change in government policy. By the way, my liberal friends almost always want to ignore the first, and my conservative friends almost always want to ignore the third. That is, it is absolutely essential that there be a change in a capital allocation decision. Everything that my friends on the liberal side want to accomplish that are not happening in today's world require a change in how somebody allocates capital, and that has to be understood. And the third point is government policy is the single biggest driver of changes in capital. This raises the really interesting question of what is the most successful government program or policy or law ever in terms of broadband deployment. Anyone want to, this pop quiz, we're going to test whether anyone's awake. Anyone want to guess? Most important government policy for broadband deployment? Yeah.
Safe harbor?
Nope.
No.
Defense?
Nope.
Cable Act.
Hands-off policy?
Nope.
2003 triennial order about fiber not being switched on.
Absolutely not. That had so little to do with it. Seriously, I wasn't on Wall Street at the time. That had nothing to do with it. No, Bob actually got the answer because he and I have done this before. It was the program access rules, the 92 Cable Act, and here's the reason why. After that passed, the cable industry led by John Malone, who interestingly in December of 92 gave the most brilliant speech ever on the future of cable and missed the internet, but he got everything else right. That was the famous 500 channel speech. What he realized was because you would now give DBS, a technology that had existed for about 10 years, access to programming, cable had a worse cost structure, a smaller number of channels, worse picture quality, worse regulatory structure, and in the long run, if it was only about multi-channel video, they were going to be dead in 10 to 20 years. So they had to come up with something else. That's what pushed them into thinking about this thing. John Doerr comes to Malone and says, let's try this thing called At Home. They do that. They only dedicate one 6 megahertz channel to it, but it turned out that's really at the core of the cable industry today. Now, here's what then happens, right? So they get into the broadband business pretty low grade, but the telephone industry, which had been offering dial-up services and had a monopoly kind of on a wholesale level. There were 5,000 ISPs, but on the wholesale level, they were a monopoly. They moved to a technology called DSL, which is faster, but the DSL technology had existed for many years before that. Why didn't they use DSL technology earlier on? Because with dial-up, they get to sell 2 lines instead of 1 line. So my point about it is the 92 Cable Act, which had, you can't find the word broadband in it, and I'm pretty sure no one who voted for it thought about broadband, but it turned out because it forced a competitive dynamic on the cable industry, forced the cable guys into an adjacent market, and that really set off what we now think of as broadband competition. So those are the things that really drive it. And so given the current market, what can government do today? And So here's what I've learned. So you got four possibilities of how you intensify competition. As to existing players in a mature market, very hard to change places. The best example of kind of changing places is T-Mobile has replaced Sprint as the third biggest wireless. That had a lot to do with the spectrum they got and the money they got from AT&T when that deal was turned down. It also had to do with a quite brilliant marketing CEO. But you can't find many examples in a mature market of existing competition really intensifying. Unbundling is something that we sometimes do. In various points in time we did it. It was a big part of the 96 Act, obviously. I think that can work when you have a mature technology, or actually an end-state technology, but if you have a changing technology, I think it's very dangerous because anytime you do unbundling, you kind of freeze capital investment in various ways. There's also the BTOP program. I thought was an appropriate use of unbundling because you had government actually funding something. So if government's going to fund it, then you might want to require a certain kind of unbundling. Third, of course, is the new entrant. I got to tell you, with Gig.U, we work with various new entrants. There may be some genius out there who can do this. In a mature market with very high CapEx and very low OpEx, very hard to do a true new entrant. So that leaves us with asymmetric adjacent market entry as the right strategy. And I think that that's what you see happening in the marketplace. And so I'm not going to just describe kind of what we saw in 2009, what the few things that we've done, and then suggest that we're going to see a lot more of it in the next few years. And we're also going to see some really interesting problems arise that I don't actually have really good answers for, but hopefully the panelists will. And so it goes something like this. We have three markets fundamentally. We had a wireless market. We had a low-end broadband market called DSL generally, some offered by one telco. The wireless market had four. And we had a high-end, other than in Fios territories, it was cable. Now, I'm not saying they don't compete with each other today. I'm just saying the level of competition is, I don't think anyone would call it intense. Indeed, the Justice Department has said a number of things to suggest wireless doesn't compete with wired. There are some people who think DSL doesn't compete with cable. I disagree with that, but I do think there's limited competition. So what we had seen prior to 2009 was about 6 upgrades, but those upgrades stopped in 2007. And the real reason they stopped was because Wall Street perceived that the Fios experiment didn't work really well. And the fundamental problem going forward was cable not only had the best network, they had the cheapest upgrade path. And that meant that if telcos, if AT&T in 2009 were to go to Wall Street and say, we want to upgrade to fiber, cost $1,500 a home, but we think it's really going to be great, Wall Street would go, great. What's cable's competitive response going to be? They're going to upgrade to DOCSIS 3.1. How much is that going to cost? About $150. You're not going to get your money back. We're not going to give you the money. So the rational thing to do, and it's very much like kind of a prisoner's dilemma where if the two prisoners trust each other not to talk, or in this case invest, they will both be better off. The rational thing in 2009 for both cable and telco to do was not to upgrade their wireline network. So the question was, how do you cause a defection? In game theory parlance. Well, the first thing you want to do is you want to help out the wireless guys so that they can basically force the DSL guys, much as the program access rules force the cable guys, and then the cable guys force the telco guys. You want to force them, you want to get them what they need, and that's about spectrum, and there were a lot of things in the broadband plan about that. Right now we see the incentive auctions, which was about that. We see the spectrum futures, 5G, which is in some ways about that. But one might argue it's even more, one might argue it's even less, but that's complicated. But the point is, you do that. The problem is it takes a really long time. But that's certainly an appropriate level as government does control that. The second thing you want to do is you want to do what you can to force either the telcos to upgrade or bring somebody else in. That's what Google Fiber is about. That's what my project Gig.U was about. You see a lot of that actually happening. It's really interesting to me. We were talking a lot today about the digital divide. We should be talking about that. I actually think analytically the way we talk about it is way too much about philanthropy and not nearly enough about economics, but that's okay. That's for another time. But here's the important thing. In about 2 years, we're going to be talking about a new digital divide. And that's the digital divide where in Atlanta, in Raleigh-Durham, in Austin, Nashville, a few other places in this country, order of magnitude 10 to 20 metro areas, you're going to be able to have 3 choices for a gig, standalone gig at about $70, $70 to $80. And in the rest of the country, you're going to be paying, I'm guessing, $100 for 100 megs. That to me is not a sustainable political situation, but I have no idea what happens because so much of that depends on the reaction of market players, like really what is Google Fiber really going to do? How much more do they how much more do they do? They are clearly looking at different business models than they were a year or so ago, but I don't see how they go nationally in a very fast way. And yet, I don't think that the mayors of a lot of towns are going to be happy reading about how, I don't think Savannah is going to be happy reading about how Atlanta has such a great service, but they don't. But that's for the next administration to deal with. But you have that part going on. And then the third thing is, at some point, the cable industry will get into mobile. They've been talking about it a long time. Comcast negotiated an MVNO with Verizon. They triggered that about 6 months ago. There's a lot of anticipation of it. It's technically not that difficult to have an entity which has huge access to Wi-Fi networks. The one commercial plug I will make, I apologize, because most of the stuff I do that's relevant to this I actually don't have a financial interest in. But if you read Walt Mossberg's piece in Verge yesterday on a company or a service called Republic Wireless, or you read the New York Times review of it comparing it to Google Fi, that's a company I have an interest in. It basically says, you know, a Wi-Fi based service can be every bit as good and in some ways better than traditional services. And while the company is important to me, it's not important to you, my point about it is cable can enter that way. It's inconceivable to me, as much as I like my friends in North Carolina who started it, that they would be able to do something that folks in Philadelphia or Stamford, Connecticut, or other places where large cable companies are couldn't do. They're very smart, but so are other people. So eventually you have the cable guys, and here is the really important point. When you ask why it didn't happen, there are lots of different explanations, but probably the biggest one is because they didn't have to. But I think as pressure grows with AT&T's Gigapower and CenturyLinks and Verizon actually with its own upgrade of some Fios stuff, I think cable clearly starts to see how they need to capture a broader consumer market and they move into mobile. So that's actually a pretty good scenario. We actually see over the next 5 years, I think, some intensification of competition. But there are going to be lots of different issues that are going to come up. You know, for example, I think there are different ways where with the people on Wall Street that I talk to discuss how cable should enter the mobile market. It'll be very interesting to see whether the government's response is great, that's competition, 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 or, oh my God, cable may become really even more dominant. There are various things, you see this in the discussion of business data services, where government has to decide, are we really trying to get competition in this market, or do we care more about competition in this market? Because there are these trade-offs. I think you're going to see, you see in the privacy debate going on, competition about who has access to data at what price and for what, that I think will become an increasingly large factor, and that's just the beginning battles of that. You saw it in an interesting way, I think, with the Facebook issue about how they were dealing with news sources, the beginning of an interesting problem, which I would just simply say, every time a platform becomes the dominant source of news delivery, they end up getting regulated in some way. Just for kind of intellectual, academic purposes, I really wish Mark Zuckerberg, instead of doing what was right for his shareholders, which he clearly did and did a very good job of it, had instead told John Thune what Donald Trump says about his taxes: none of your damn business. I'm here to make money. My algorithm tells me how to make money, That's what I'm going to do. I'm not even going to tell you how we do it. And if I skew it to Democrats, or if I skew it to a liberal point of view, that's just because the algorithm's telling it to me. I'm a pure capitalist. I wish he had said that, because then that would have put the Republicans in a really interesting place about how they would have reacted, and that just would have been so much more entertaining to watch. But my point is that as we go forward and we talk about competition, data is going to be a piece of it. And there's all kinds of public and private data that I think will be trickier in the years to come. So let me just sum up by saying that, you know, kind of like the framework that I have, my answers to all three questions are, we want to remove bandwidth constraints on innovation, growth, and social progress. We want policy to create incentives for competitive upgrades. It must drive changes in capital allocations and the economics of deployment. Policy should look to where it can lower input costs for all potential competitors, but particularly for adjacent market entrants. And that's where we, that's how we get the competition that can lead to progress over broadband. Back to you.
Thanks, Blair. As always, great set of insights and lots more questions. So one of the questions maybe we can get to that, you know, implied. One of the things, by the way, you didn't address is sort of the cable role in 5G, which a lot of people are thinking, oh, that's about spectrum, when in fact it's not about spectrum. Yeah. And maybe we can talk about that, because that becomes really important in terms of thinking about next generation and what that means for broadband. Related is you talk about wireless competition, and the question is, can wireless in next generation, or even this generation, compete, right? Especially in underserved or unserved areas like rural. Like, what is backhaul? That came up at one of this morning's sessions in a question from Gabriel. And then, you know, picking off of that, maybe what we'll do is we'll start in terms of people responding, and I'd like actually to start with Jim. And we haven't obviously rehearsed this. And the reason, Jim, is because one of the things that Blair talked about was, you know, the economists would call it a contestable market. But the question is, if in fact there is no disruptor, I mean, in the past, and I don't want to debate the current, you know, regulations or laws, either restricting or not restricting muni broadband. That's not the point. The question is, what we've seen in the past is where broadband upgrades have not been at the top of a local agenda. Municipalities raise their hand and they say, we're going to do it. Sometimes they do it, but more often than not, the existing operators say, oh, well, never mind, we'll put it higher on the agenda, right? So from your perspective, working with municipalities on local broadband projects, either one of those to get more broadband for consumers a win, and right? Either somebody else does it, or your clients do it, or maybe have your perspective on the role of what you do in terms of driving upgrades investment. And then there's this broader question, which is, oftentimes we hear that competition can, you know, I love the phrase destructive competition. I don't know what that means, because people sometimes say, well, if there's too much competition, we don't get investment and innovation. But empirically, more times than not, when you see competition, whether people want to or firms want to or not, they invest and innovate because they're forced to, which I think was our sort of 1992 cable story. So, Jim, why don't you pick up with some of those things, and I'd love to hear your reflections.
Okay. Just to put this into context, I've been involved over the last couple of decades in working with communities across the country that have been those new entrants, and I, to the extent I could prepare for this, I was thinking about, as a new entrant, what do you need for competition to work? But let me shift in view of Blair's introduction and your question. So from the standpoint of communities, The question is a fundamentally different question than the one that has been posed so far, because to them, an advanced communications network is a platform and driver for everything that is important to their community. And they're not thinking of it in terms of a profit-making venture that they should get into, even to provide competition to the incumbent carriers if they believe that the incumbent carriers aren't serving the community well. But, but think of communities as you would have thought of communities looking at electrification a century ago, where having access to electricity enabled so much to happen that was meaningful to the community. Here, now, communities across the country are looking at advanced networks as drivers and platforms of economic development and education, healthcare, public safety, smart transportation, and on and on. Just about everything that you can think of will be enabled by advanced communications networks, and you can see simultaneous progress in every one of these areas over the same network. So communities right now are eager to work with willing incumbents or to work with new entrants like Google and others to do it themselves if they can't find willing incumbents or new entrants like Google. And there are many, many communities across the country that will not see a Google or will not see a willing incumbent partner. And so right now we're seeing across the country great interest in all of these things, particularly public-private partnerships, where communities are looking for business models that can make the networks work for them, work for private partners, and get those networks out there. Now, we're focusing in this day primarily on fiber networks, because it's clearly the fiber networks that can support all of these things and is essential for backhaul, even for the wireless uses. And so that brings me to the way that communities are looking at this. If later we want to get back to the question that I was originally going to address, structurally, what do new entrants need in order to be able to compete successfully? I'd be happy to do it then.
Great. I definitely want to come back to that, because that is related to sort of Blair saying that there are things that need to be done in order to get that investment. But you're talking about sort of architecturally, right? Needing broadband even for the wireless bits. Nitin, I'm going to actually turn to you now. How many people here have ever heard of Cloudflare? Oh, great. Then more than I thought, right? But Ellie and I have a particular reason. A former colleague is there. But why don't you, for those who don't, and then if you could sort of pick up on that, some of the points.
Hi, my name is Nitin, and thanks. There's definitely more people than I expected. We sort of sit behind the scenes, and if we're doing a good job, people needn't know who we are. So I'm at a company called Cloudflare. We're a web security and performance company that sits in front of about 4 million websites. If you visit, and we add about 10,000 websites every day. If you visit any of those websites, we make sure that the website loads as safely and as quickly as possible. If you're a bad person, we make sure that you can't get to the website or can't overwhelm the website. And if you're a good person, we try to serve you from as close as possible to where you are. We do about 10 trillion web requests every month and do about 1 trillion page views every month. That's equivalent to seeing substantively everybody on the internet, an average of 600 times every month. So we probably saw you 20 times today. And that's an important sort of responsibility that we've come into. And so we provide, because we provide security and performance, we stop distributed denial of service attacks, and we touch a number of these issues. We touch issues of interconnection because our network, as of yesterday, Cloudflare is a member of more internet exchanges, which are interconnection points, than any company in the world, Google, Facebook, Akamai, et cetera. And so we interface with the ISPs, we interface with hosting companies, we touch on a number of these different issues, and so we're sort of an adjacent player. Also, just to quickly qualify, I'm really an operations person, so far from the policy person. My typical day is stuffing Cat5 cables in a box, and so it's, but happy to contribute to the conversation. So we add, on average, one new data center. So we're now in about 100 cities. We add one new data center every week, and so we'll be in about 125 cities across 60 countries by the end of the year. And so I can't necessarily speak about sort of, like, we're not an ISP, can't necessarily speak about those issues, but we're sort of adjacent. We do everything we can to, if the end goal is to make a better, safer internet, I think the internet provider has a piece to play. An adjacent player like Cloudflare has a piece to play. We're happy to do our part. I'm a consumer of I'm a sort of buyer of the internet, both in my individual capacity. I come home and I call Comcast and I try to get the internet working again. And I go to work and I buy a big internet connection on behalf of 4 million websites. But it's fundamentally similar. In one case, you don't get to actually redline the contract. The other one, you get to actually see what you're signing up for. But it's a very interesting experience.
Ellie, you've looked at sort of competition. I mean, so you are you've actually literally written a book on competition in the sector, right? And it was recently published. And it was a tome. It probably should have been more than one volume, but everything got bound together. So from your perspective on this question about competition, broadband, benefits, what you've heard so far, what do you see?
Well, it's good first kind of to put things in perspective. So when I listened to Lee Rainey this morning, he said something along the lines that older people, they know all the bad stuff, but they kind of have not processed the good stuff. And I think there's a general observation here, which is that bad news travels much faster than good news. And furthermore, if we equate light with truth, then bad news travels faster than truth, faster than light. And physicists are still kind of working out how that is possible, since it's contradicts various physics principles. So what do we find for competition? People do have concerns about concentration, lack of competition in the United States, and to some extent it is true. But it is also true if you compare it, as we have, with 30 countries around the world, major countries, for lots of industries for 20 or so years, you will see that the United States, bad as it might be, is still in competitive terms heads and shoulders above most other countries in the world when it comes to HHI, Herfindahl-Hirschman index type concentration. Now, so that's the first observation, and it is important to make because it puts in context, because in some ways, what markets are we talking about? We're talking about platform infrastructure markets. In those markets, the regulatory system, and in the United States it is particularly well developed over the years because we've had more than a century to play with that and to refine it, has learned how to deal with market power in infrastructure. And so we have a variety of policies in place that kind of reduce market power, deal with this interconnection and all kinds of other stuff that is out there. And different countries deal with this in other ways too. In some cases, in fact, because there's unbundling. In other cases, there's even a national infrastructure ownership, such as in Singapore or in Australia. But kind of in some ways, that is perhaps the easy part of competition, because the harder part is actually the applications on top of it. it used to be that the focus of our development efforts was if you build it, they will come. Let's increase the infrastructure and then exciting things will happen. And they did. It was great. But I think now the focus might be shifting to another way of looking at it. If they come, you will build it. That is, and what will come, I think it is video. Video is going to be the driver of infrastructure. And the question then is video and similar type activities, whether in fact competition and market concentration, how they are going to be on those kind of in those markets. And if there is a winner or winners in this field, as I do believe that there will be for various reasons, such as economies of scale, network effects, high fixed costs, low marginal cost, a variety of things. If market power emerges, and you can see this already, Google's market power, Facebook market power, YouTube, and so on and so forth, if that has happened, if that will happen, so what are we going to do about that? Because it is easier to regulate and to control and to use antitrust to infrastructure. And it is much harder to deal with it when it comes to, say, video, because then we get into the area of national and societal sensitivities that are different from society to society. The French don't care about, kind of, as I said, what they do as long as they pronounce it correctly. But Americans do care very much what is shown, and Germans don't show kind of Nazi stuff. And in Thailand, you have to be sensitive about the royal family, etc. You have a great number of societal sensitivities of media power, cultural power, domestic culture, etc., etc. And we have not even started to have a decent discussion how to deal with market power in those areas and how to kind of develop competition in those areas. And so that, I believe, is going to be the challenge for the next years, how to integrate video into this system without just simply porting over the broadcast model in the way that Brussels has done it. Just take, basically, we have broadcasting, and we call kind of this stuff linear TV over the internet, and we're just going to import the same model and we're going to apply it there. So that is going to be the interesting, intellectually interesting, politically very sensitive discussion that we have to engage in.
Thanks. I want to come, Jim. Right, you asked yourself the question, but you didn't answer it. I want to go to Kate, but so I'm to prepare you for that. So after Kate. So you've heard all of this. So what's the government doing? In other words, from your, so again, if you look at Kate's bio, she's now, working at the White House, but she also is at AID, so she has both a domestic and a global perspective. So when you look at the lessons learned that, you've seen, how are you thinking about these questions today at the White House? And there've been some really, really important examples where, especially serving the unserved and the dramatically underserved areas, and there have been some real progress there. So why don't you
Thanks.
address those, or whatever you want.
Or anything. Thank you, and thank you so much for having me. Kate Gage, I'm actually in the International Affairs Division of the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House. So I work very closely with many of the teams that are working on a lot of the very important domestic issues. And I think I have many colleagues who have spoken here today and on the panel who do focus on that and who are much more versed in the domestic side. But I do look specifically internationally and at how OSTP is driving connectivity abroad, and based on my experience from USAID, I do have a specific interest in the developing side. So I think one of the things I'm most interested in hearing a lot from you all and what we're exploring is what that role of the public sector is in driving competitiveness. I think that we have quite a few initiatives out of the U.S. government. I think if you were around for Undersecretary Novelli's talk, and I see Manu in the back who was speaking on the Global Connect initiative, which we're very supportive of, and I think has done amazing work in the last year or so in pulling all of the variety of different initiatives across the U.S. government together and kind of looking across and saying, what can we do as a whole? What are the OPICs and the USTDAs and the USAIDs and State Departments doing individually? And then I've been really excited over the last few years of seeing what USAID has been doing with initiatives like the Global Broadband Innovation, the Alliance for Affordable Internet. There's the Africa Broadband Partnership. So there's a lot of these different activities. I also am, I think, required to mention the fact that we are really focusing this in light of the UN Sustainable Development Goals that were announced last year at the UN General Assembly. And in September, we will all be looking back at those that specifically identify a lot of connectivity issues as goals that we are all attempting to achieve by 2030. So, some of what we work on focuses on affordability, a lot on open access. I think one of the most interesting things for us right now is getting just, I think, to the point that Ali was making about the application side driving the infrastructure. And I would say that part for us right now in the developing world, where the infrastructure side obviously needs a lot of improvement and development. What we're really exploring is where the public sector can have a role in different innovative delivery models and innovative service models to sort of reverse engineer this and see if we can have that side really help to develop both U.S. but also partner investment in the infrastructure side. So I mean, I think there's a couple different specific examples. I'm happy to kind of get onto some of them, but I think mainly we're just really excited to hear a lot of what everybody is thinking on this and see where we can.
Yeah, and if you want to just give some of the concrete examples, Secretary Novelli, Undersecretary Novelli this morning talked about Tunisia, as a marriage broker, if you will, with the EBRD. But if you want to mention some of the other examples, feel free to do so.
Yeah, I mean, it's been interesting the last couple of years because some of it has been very specific. Like I know that USAID spent a lot of time through the Global Broadband Innovation program working with Indonesia to develop their national broadband plan. And I think we're seeing some pretty significant investment coming from both U.S. government but also from the Indonesian government to drive access there. And it's and then we have smaller projects like working on, and this is something that the U.S. government and the White House specifically right now is really focusing on, of connectivity, local connectivity being driven to refugee communities, and specifically, I think the biggest and most well-known example of that is the work that was done in Dadaab in northern Kenya. And I think that was an interesting model that USAID specifically worked on of sort of aggregating demand through NGOs and then seeing about developing out the infrastructure to support that demand with the intention and the delivery of free access to the refugee population with the NGOs paying their way. And we're really interested right now. Actually, the president about 2 weeks ago issued a call to action to the private sector around to spur private sector investment in the refugee response. And one of the core pillars of the response to the refugee crisis is around connectivity for refugee populations, specifically internationally, but of course there's a domestic interest, wherever that might be applicable. That's not just camps, that's also urban, peri-urban communities. But it would be really interesting also to talk to this community and see if there's interest in how people can get engaged, how different organizations can get engaged in that, based on some of the models that we've seen work so far in Turkey and Kenya and Jordan. But definitely interested in how we can play a role and partner along that.
So to some of those, it's, what I'm hearing is government as catalyst, government as convener for effectively a public-private partnership, which flows into some of the things that Jim was talking about.
Yeah.
On the domestic side. So, I mean, do you want to, Jim? Blair, please.
I'm very intrigued by a number of things I've read about, and I agree with Bob's characterization of them. One of the things that characterizes a lot of the local efforts I've been involved with, though, is a very conscious effort to lower the cost of deployment, lower the cost of certain inputs. And one of the things I haven't seen on the international side, the aggregation demand obviously makes a lot of sense too, but have some of these efforts, how have they affected the cost curve of actual deployments? Or is that not on the table?
That's a pretty core goal for, I think.
Oh, I think it's a core goal, but
Yeah.
I haven't seen how does it actually operate? Can you give me an example of that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you have any specific areas that you'd be more interested in. I mean, I think in looking globally, I mean, this is where it's interesting just to see the variety of different models. So I think we're starting to see a lot more of where there can be either free deployment or advertising or commercially driven deployment.
That goes to the business model of once you deliver it. What I'm talking about is how do you affect the way various players, most specifically the government, and there are other things that affect it too, actually lower the cost of deployment. One of the interesting things about what Google did when they were with the Google Fiber thing was that they essentially ran a competition between local governments that caused various governments to lower the cost of deployment. They could have done what the NFL did and said, we're going to do this in only a few places, write us a big check. Instead of paying for a stadium, you're going to pay for broadband. Instead, what they did was they said, will you agree to, and there are lots of small little details about how they did it, but they effectively lowered how much it would cost to them to deploy a fiber network. What I haven't seen, and it could be that I just missed it, in what the president called for with the refugees and what the global initiative was. And I'm not being critical, I'm just asking on the deployment side, how does it lower the cost of deployment? Because that's actually, if you have $1 billion to spend, you can reach, let's call it, 20 million people. But if you can lower the cost of deployment, that same $1 billion can reach 40 billion people. So that's kind of where my question's going.
Yeah, so I don't know about the refugee camps, but I do know, for example, Blair, in terms of tsunami relief and bringing connectivity in, one of the things that the government did through the State Department was facilitate and eliminate, custom barriers, and so it was also, in those cases, speed of deployment. So there was a government involvement on turning dials.
That's the kind of thing.
That's
not a systemic thing.
No.
That's an emergency.
No, that's right. But the question is, how do you take learnings from the emergency thing and make it systemic to speed the deployment and lower the cost? One of the things that struck me in Nigeria was a statement by the then Minister of Communications, who said that 70% of the cost of building a fiber core network across Nigeria were taxes and fees. In other words, it was local licensing, it was the municipal franchise fee, it was off the books fees, and that
high number.
70% of the cost. I mean, that's huge. Ellie, you want to say something? Then I do want to get back to Jim.
It seems to me as important and sensitive it is to deal with the trailing edge of development of lagging countries and lagging parts of society, and I'm not minimizing this at all, but we have to balance this also with the consideration of the leading edge, because this is, after all, what got us there. The internet started out as an innovative effort, and the question is whether it can be sustained. So I have to say that it's really hard to have anything bad to say against public-private collaborations. I mean, this sounds so good. But realistically, what does it mean? The problem here is that technology and business development have been progressing at Moore's law type acceleration, faster and faster and faster. Government processes, on the other hand, have actually not only not kept pace, but they've actually slowed down, partly based on the same technologies. It is easier to organize opposition. It is easier to kind of collaborate and to oppose. Everything becomes slower in Washington, and the unhappiness with Washington is a symptom of that. And so so you put in something that is really moving fast, and you link it with something that is really moving very slowly, and both sides are going to be really unhappy about this. So I'm not sure if this is ultimately going to work. Now, it becomes even worse if you start to harmonize these things internationally. And we're here at an Internet Governance Forum, and that is in the business of, kind of globalizing these approaches. And again, doesn't it sound great, harmony and harmonizing, but it means slowing down the process, achieving compromises that work for Nicaragua as well as for Canada, as well as for Argentina, and in the end, nobody's going to be happy. So one of the important conclusions that I have come to is that this whole notion of internet governance and global internet governance is not going to work in the past. It has worked in the future. It has worked in the past, but the past is the past. The future is one in which different countries, different companies, different company coalitions are going to go their own ways, and they will interoperate, and it'll be a bit messy, but so what? At least they can do what they want in a faster way. And so that's kind of my 2 cents worth here.
Okay, so let me just address the point that Ellie just made so as to remove a potential ambiguity. Municipalities did fiber to the home well before the private sector did. We're pioneers there. And as entrants, we're talking about something different than governments as governing, providing policies of this kind. So in the capacity of partners in a project, they can move very fast. When you're talking about country solving problems and all that's a different issue. So what is needed from the standpoint of government-related entrant? First thing that I need to say is that antitrust is a meaningless solution at the local level. It may, from a country standpoint or otherwise, be very important, but it's much too slow, much too expensive. An entrant cannot successfully bring an antitrust action that would work within the time frame that they need to enter a market. So what's needed, first of all, is something that is designed to deal with doing business kinds of issues. In talking about that, I'm going to start with principles and use your reference to video and cable as a way to illustrate this. First thing that one must recognize is the tremendous, tremendous benefits of incumbency. Having made investments that you can improve incrementally, having access to poles, ducts, conduits, having the customer base there paying you on a day-by-day basis across your footprint while you're upgrading at your own pace. These are tremendous benefits. And if you're really serious about a competitor coming in to compete with an incumbent, you have to make it easy and cost-effective for a new entrant to be able to do that. Now, let's look at cable, look at video. To a lesser degree today than used to be in the past, an entrant had to use its network in every way possible and draw revenues from that network in every way possible. And that meant including a cable offering. Now, even Google, when Google sought to get involved in this area, it thought that it could offer high-speed connectivity without getting involved in offering services, without offering video services, and it found that it couldn't do it. It couldn't make its business model work, and of course that's what our clients had found for decades. And so to make video work, what do you run into? What kinds of issues, competitive issues, are out there that need to be solved? Well, there's access to content. Where do you get the content that you're going to sell? That is a set of issues that needs to be dealt with. Retransmission consent issues, programming access issues. That's one area. Predatory pricing and targeted rate discrimination, another major problem that the new entrants see. Access to customers. Now, how do you block access to customers? Well, in the US, in many of our cities, 25, 30, 35% of populations are in what we call multiple dwelling units, apartment buildings, cooperatives, and things like that. That's an easy opportunity to block competition, because if you happen to have your cables in the building when it's being built, that's easy entrance. If you're the second person in, getting access to the customers is very difficult, and the way that the cable industry dealt with that over the years was to erect a series of exclusivities, exclusive sales agreements, exclusive easements, exclusive control of inside wiring, exclusive marketing, so you get past one, you run into the next level of exclusivity, and so on and so forth. The FCC did a rulemaking and dealt with exclusive sales agreements, but it left all the other exclusivities in place, so that remains a problem and a challenge yet to be dealt with. And so for entry to work, it's important to deal in a detailed way with all of the areas of business where there are choke points. And sorry to say, there's no single solution, and you take care of that and competition occurs. A country that is serious about making competition happen has to deal with all of these things. Now, back when he was the head of policy at the FCC, Pepper said something that's very important here as well. He said that there are two kinds of discrimination. One is when you treat similarly situated companies differently. The other is when you treat differently situated companies similarly. And let's stay, for example, with the FCC's rules on MDUs. The FCC bent over backwards to treat incumbents the same as new entrants when they're in fundamentally different positions. If you have a new entrant that needs exclusivity for a period of time in order to pay for its investment in the wiring and creating a business in the MDU, that's one thing. If you have an incumbent that is already in and uses exclusivities to keep new entrants out, that's something different. They're differently situated. Could the FCC have developed rules that accommodate the differences in incumbents and new entrants if it wanted to stimulate new entry? Of course they could, but they didn't. And so there are issues like that we can debate about. There are dozens of issues like that we can have debates about. But when it comes to facilitating entry, it's hard work, heavy lifting, and it has lots of moving parts.
So I'm going to open it up to the floor for questions in a second, but I want to come back to a point that you just made for a variety of reasons. In a mature market, new entry is really difficult. All right, and Blair, you started with that.
Though Jim is using new entrant slightly different than me. What I'm referring to is a new entrant who basically just brings money and talent, as opposed to, Google is actually not a new entrant. They've been delivering bits. They have an extensive backbone, all kinds of, But Jim's point is exactly right, that from the perspective of entering Louisville, Google is a new entrant. Access to MDUs is really important. Access to video content is really important. Access to polls, I mean, the thing that made the cable industry possible back when they were a very nascent business was access to utility poles, which a young lobbyist named Tom Wheeler fought very hard for in 1978.
Nitin, Cloudflare's a new entrant, right? I mean, compared to Akamai and some of the other players providing, CDNs, et cetera. Is this an issue, or is it, as a new entrant in the sort of middle mile, backhaul, wholesale versus retail? Do you see that as a difference, or?
So first of all, thank you for just listening to the sort of the last whole things. I feel like distinctly adjacent in terms of, so thank you for bearing with me, and I'll try better to sort of tie into some of the things you're mentioning, because they touch each other, but they're also adjacent. As an individual, I've only worked at small companies, and so you used to like small teams of sort of interesting people working really, really fast, being really, really paranoid, and so that's a fun experience, and I do recommend it. And so I think we love the idea of. I think you have to have a certain amount of trust that if you go hammer through one set of projects, new stuff will emerge. But until you sort of get done with this, you can't get to the next thing. And so our interest is not in building another Akamai. They're, and we actually play very nicely with them. I think the opportunity really is to sort of grow the pie, and sort of sign up a different set of customers. So you referenced Akamai and content delivery. That's one of the features we provide. I'd say about 96% of Cloudflare customers pay us $0 to sign up, and they're immediately fast all over the world. None of them, so they're completely adjacent. But if I may, I thought I'd share a couple sort of tactical dilemmas we face, both domestically and elsewhere. So domestically, there is. So right now we're working on doubling the number of US cities which have Cloudflare data centers. So we're going from sort of the usual 8 or so to about 25. So we're going to Nashville, St. Louis, Salt Lake City, Kansas City, et cetera. Where do you deploy your gear? Do you deploy your gear at a neutral data center? It doesn't always exist. Do you deploy only for one ISP? And to what, like, sort of what should the right philosophy be there? So we hit a bunch of sort of these questions. And so we're both trying to go really, really fast, but we're also trying to be cognizant of how we can sort of influence sort of the dynamics in those various markets. Internationally, it's similar. So we're as of this morning, as a quick aside, as of this morning, we turned up our Luanda, Angola POP, and so 4 million sites are faster in Angola, which are not served from London. So that's hundreds of milliseconds improvement. And so in each of those places, in Djibouti, in Angola, et cetera, we again face those philosophical debates of like, do you go to a neutral facility, work with everybody, or do you provide your content to a carrier, a ISP, and sort of what's your role there? One example that comes to mind, so a couple quick fun facts. We pay more to serve bits to the largest ISP in Paraguay than Comcast. And so that if you want to do video, if you want to send a lot more traffic, that's a big bottleneck. And so we pay more to serve Australia than the entire continent of Europe. And again, there's something out of whack there.
And why?
Because of the dynamics of that market. So sort of typically incumbents that have termination monopolies. Yeah. So take Korea, for example, which is wrestling with that question. So you've got Korea Telecom, SK, LG, and you have the long tail. And the government has proposed policy to essentially determine who's going to pay what, how much. And so it's not market driven, but they're saying, if you fall in this category, you're a tier 1 ISP and you need to pay so much. If you're a tier 2 ISP, you need to pay so much. And they've determined that the price is going to fall 8% every year. And so in their wisdom, they're convinced that they can sort of plan their way out of it. But in effect, it creates a balkanization. What happens is that all the interesting content moves abroad. That country actually gets more cut off from international content, local content, and you both fail to spur more competition, but you actually end up balkanizing things, which is sort of unfortunate. Another sort of fun aside, on December 30th night, I was with some friends and ducked out to quickly write a blog post for Cairo, and it was incredible that 11 of the top 20 websites in Cairo were already using Cloudflare, despite the fact we were serving them from London. And again, we had that dilemma. We were trying to work with Telecom Egypt, an incumbent. We were trying to do the neutral thing, and it's challenging. It was cool because millions of sites were faster, and they were served locally from Cairo. But again, sort of what's our role domestically as we go to these small cities? What's our role internationally? We just try to sort of make the best decisions we can, go as fast as possible. We love the internet exchange model. We're at 138 internet exchanges. We're only too happy for other folks to join us at all of those internet exchanges. We have an open peering policy, but again, we're just one piece, and our only tool is to go as fast as possible.
Thanks. Yeah. So, in other words, hack the system. Just keep going. Go fast. We can keep going here, but I want to open it up. Any questions from the floor? Yeah. Actually, yeah. Microphone up front. Yes. Oh, I was going to go here to the front first, but.
Hello, am I audible? Yeah, okay. I'm Shada. I'm a research fellow at Penn Law. My question is, I was quite struck by the statement that discrimination is in two forms. It's not just about treating similarly placed individuals differently, but differently placed individuals similarly. And that seems to be a regulatory trend as amongst multiple regulatory institutions across the globe, especially in this area. I wanted to ask the panel what they see as drivers of that kind of trend, in that they look at MVNOs, very similar to the way they would look at other players in the market in terms of deployment. Do you see that as a trend, firstly? Secondly, if that is so, why is that? And what are your opinions on it?
So really, you're asking, what are the drivers? Yeah.
I'm asking, yes, what are the drivers of that kind of trend? Because there seems to be, as the model of importing Ellie pointed to, was that there's a model of importing rulemaking with respect to one set of markets to another set. And is that really hampering the way competition would function in those markets?
Anybody have an answer?
I think it's really totally impossible anymore to to harmonize all the various platforms and all the various approaches in all the various countries. So I think you just have to live with that. So when we're listening here also to Australia and whatever the crazy rules might be that they have, I mean, in some ways, that's their problem. I mean, why should we solve it for them? If it's good for us to have low prices, good. And if it's so, therefore, if they kind of want to screw themselves up, it's their problem. I don't think we have to kind of go around proselytizing other societies that they should have low prices if they want to tax their own people. I mean, in telecom, we kind of pepper, isn't that true that we've done that for 20, 30, 40 years, tried to persuade the world of the kind of the benefits of competition. And of course it was right, but you know, we're kind of, I don't see why the United States function has to be to educate the world on kind of on what the proper policy is.
Yeah. Marina, and I'll come back to your comment because I do remember a meeting that we actually had with the board of KT in Seoul the day that we announced the FCC's benchmark accounting rate decision. And try to remember that, and we'll come back to it. Marina.
First of all, thank you for the very interesting discussion. I'd like to echo on Ellie's comment about the network of the past and network of the future, because this is a point that, from a different perspective, I have brought to the attention this morning during the morning panel. In particular, I'd like you to think about the fact that most of the past infrastructure have been developed without the need for the internet because it was not known. And this makes a complete difference in the way we have to deal with the network of phase 2. Because naturally, now we know that we want the internet, and everything is conceived knowing that the internet is a basic part, probably the most important part of what we want to offer to the user from the net point of view. So the design of the future network and the integration between the global network with respect to the local country-based network reality is, to me, the dramatic change with respect to the past design. And so I would like to thank Ellie very much for bringing this point again on a completely different perspective, also from, I think you were talking from an economic viewpoint, but this is also what, as an engineer, as an ICT engineer, I feel very much.
Thanks. And then you just give the microphone to the woman in back of you. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, my question is to Professor Noan. You mentioned that, so my name is Natalia Fodic. I'm here based in DC. My question is to Professor Noan. He mentioned that competition in the infrastructure market, it's easier to do that than to the service and content layer. And I agree to that, but I wonder which solutions we have and how do you see that developing? What should be the approach in the future for antitrust in this particular layer?
Well, first to Marina, I would say the part of the issue really is what is the internet anymore? I mean, earlier today we heard about kind of how much the smartphones is being used, and that's kind of, I mean, it reaches the internet, but largely it's kind of outside of it also. And so I think it's going to be IP driven, but not necessarily the public internet. And there will be more and more of that traffic will move out to other arrangements, partly if regulatory constraints will exist, such as net neutrality and so on. So people will kind of move the traffic to other forms of more private arrangements and then at some point interconnect with something. So I think that's kind of inevitable unless you ratchet up the regulatory system. Now, as to the issue of the of how to deal with it, I didn't say it was easier to regulate infrastructure, although to some extent it is, in a sense that the infrastructure is there and you can grab it and it's only a handful of players and they cannot go offshore and something like that. So it's kind of easier to lay your hands on it, but also because we simply have more experience. So if you ask now the question, how do we deal with that? I think in some ways I owe you an answer and I don't have it. Because if you conclude, let's say that Google has 98% of everything in 98 countries, so what are you going to do about that? The Brussels people, they deal with some of symptoms, so there's vertical integration, or but that's just the symptom of market power. But with the market power itself, how do you deal with that? We actually don't quite know how to do that. And so that really is an intellectual exercise foremost. And in some ways, in that sense, universities are a good place and think tanks are a good place to start before it goes into the legislative type arena, where it kind of starts probably with an insufficient analytical thinking.
Jim?
Yeah, I was just going to take the liberty of reversing things and ask a question. Does IEEE have policy discussions about how network architecture can affect future competitiveness? So you're looking at PON network designs and the limitations of it.
Yes, I think there is Chris that maybe you want to reply, but I can anticipate yes, because we are dealing this in the different initiatives. But probably, Chris, you have a more specific answer to that?
Not necessarily, and not getting into the technical aspects of it, but this is sort of a new area for the IEEE, where we've been so focused on research and publishing and conferences and so forth. So we have a number of groups that have realized in the last couple of years that we really need to get our head around policy and using our technical clout to inform policy. And so these groups are now getting started. You saw Karen McCabe, who spoke this morning with Marina and Kathy. She's heading up groups. There's a group directly from our board of directors, which is addressing policy issues. So these are all things, and this is why you're seeing a growing presence of the IEEE at events like this, and certainly the one in Guadalajara will have a strong presence at as well, to address these sorts of issues. So we're just getting there. I think, honestly speaking, a little off the record, I think we were behind the ball in getting into policy, and really we needed to do this earlier, so I'm really glad we're doing it now. But it's not something we've done enough of in the past. And
Right, and I applaud you for doing that too, because it's easy to use technologies, architectures today and celebrate that you have a gigabit network, only to find out that you have locked yourself into something that will constrain your flexibility in just a few years.
So I'm going to come back, Blair. Ellie said, video is a driver. I think this is also one of the things that you've said. And you in passing talked about abundant broadband. What is could you sort of link the two? In other words, if video is the driver, is DSL enough? Do you need abundant broadband in your mind to be able to have sort of competing platforms, or sort of access networks? And what are you seeing in terms of wireless as a competitor? And by the way, I use wireless consciously. I don't just say mobile, right? So there's different flavors of sort of wireless. Access to the device is increasingly a wireless connection. In fact, the vast majority of the connections are wireless connections to the devices.
And most of the traffic goes over Wi-Fi rather than cellular. Yeah. So it's mostly nomadic rather than mobile.
Abundant
Yeah.
versus, yeah.
So is DSL sufficient? No, but the question is, how much more do you need? Do you really need a gig? Back when I was doing gig.u full time, I got that question a lot, and I must have had 10 different answers to it. I'm not sure which one is most appropriate for this audience, but yeah, we don't know. What we see, I guess to a certain extent, I'll just say that fundamentally in an economy, we do two things. One is we manipulate and distribute atoms, and the other is we offer information. And increasingly, the economy is about information, the collection of data, the storage of data, the analysis of data. And this was in many different forms, of course. But whenever you lower the cost of an input, you tend to use it more. Moore's law is lowering the cost of information. You can look at a lot of different things. Ellie's right about video, but I would argue probably is because I'm getting to a certain age, or my mother is already at that age, or my in-laws, where you really wish that two-way video was much more sufficient than it really is, particularly in terms of visiting doctors. And that by itself may be the largest driver economically because of the reduction of the cost. If you could reduce the number of times someone who's over the age of 85 goes to a doctor by 25, 30, 40%, which I think you could do if you had really good two-way video, you know, that's a huge, may not be in terms of bits, but it's certainly in terms of economics a huge thing. But the truth is, and someone said this in the panel earlier, 10 years ago, there were all kinds of things. Pokemon Go is just the latest iteration of one, which, by the way, huge data suck that no one would have anticipated and accelerates augmented reality in a variety of ways. But, you know, we don't know. Some kid who's right now in middle school is going to invent something that's going to require a symmetric gig, and then that wouldn't be abundant.
Yeah, and so part of your gig U thesis was if you provide a gigabit in university towns where you have really creative people who don't sleep a lot,
Yeah.
that good things could bubble up. So
Good things always happen at 4 o'clock in the morning.
yeah. So now that gig U is out there,
Right.
do you have any examples yet?
Oh, yeah, I actually do, but I think they're all, first of all, I just think it's way too, somebody when I started it said until you get to 30 million users of a gig, someone from Time Warner Cable said this to me, no one's going to really develop applications for it. And I think that's, you know, that's primarily right. So the examples I would use about whether it's transmitting genomic sequencing or telehealth for seniors or a variety of other things. I don't, you know, 3D, what the Smithsonian is doing about basically taking the object of the Smithsonian and making them available to 3,000 schools. Oh, there's bunches of things that are kind of cool. I mean, you have kids who are in, you know, the only viola player in a small town in Iowa who gets to essentially play music with people in Los Angeles and Seattle. But I think those are actually quite small in some way. I think we do have to get to a critical mass where people start really thinking more creatively.
Ellie, and then I want to come back to Kate, so Kate can be thinking about one of the questions that came up earlier, Kate. I'm going to go to Ellie, but I want Kate to be able to think about your answering. I think Ellie even made the point that, and it's almost by design, government purposely moves slowly. In some cases, maybe not purposely, but markets are moving very, very quickly. And so, given where, you know, what you've seen in other countries, but also within the some of the programs at the administration, how do you sort of begin to either try to reconcile those things or, you know, move forward without things getting in the way? But Ellie.
Really, just quickly, I normally agree with almost everything that Blair says, but here there's one point of disagreement, which is if you make cheaper, easier for people to consume medical services, then they will consume more of it. And you still will therefore, if you make access to medicine available to the entire globe by high-powered networks and wireless networks, they will queue up to the Mayo Clinic or wherever they will go all the time. You will have higher cost medical service. I mean, right now, in some ways, we keep the cost of the system down by rationing it, by making it inconvenient. You make it convenient for people, they will be at the doctor twice a day.
Oh my God. And so,
I mean, I'm not saying that this is bad.
what a horror show that some people live who otherwise might die.
They will of course, it's societally good, but it's not for efficient. It's not the efficiency.
Oh, no.
argument.
Look, first of all, this could take us off something. I was making an observation about people who are 85 who have to go to the doctors 2 or 3 times a week. If they could go just once a week, there's an enormous efficiency in that, and people would pay.
They would go 6 times.
Well, maybe they'll go 6 times a week, but they'll be shorter. And
This is not a session on rationing healthcare.
Yeah.
We're going to go to Dave in the front.
This almost looks like Back to the Future. there are a lot of things happening in many, many countries. In Asia, for instance, the use of telemedicine to access parents who are no longer with their children. The problem of the villages and the cities are a major problem, and there's a lot of attention being paid to, in fact, remote medicine, taking care of the parents even though the children are no longer around. That's happening in this country, but slowly. Getting near the age where I'm beginning to worry about those things, they're real. Comment Ellie made sort of bothers me a little bit, and that's, you said networks will be IP-based. I think that's ignoring the fact that the field is moving very, very rapidly. There's a number of technologies which may or may not develop. If they do develop, they're going to put a strain on networks, the like of which we haven't seen in a long, long time. And a gig ain't going to make it. And when you start going up past to very high-speed networks, IP doesn't work anymore. So, you know, the problem is we're solving a current problem. And the problem is that this field moves very, very rapidly, and I have not seen any sign of it slowing down.
Yeah, I like that, actually, what you're saying. Right?
So, David, did you want to say, ask a question?
I have a question after you answer.
All right. So,
I have two questions.
So, yeah, Kate's saying, ask your questions. Just hold the microphone close to your mouth.
Yes. Until we get free medical care. Ellie, you described how I have two questions. Ellie, you described how the U.S. is heads and shoulders above most countries in terms of HHI. Can you flesh out or define HHI to the audience and talk about how that relates to abundant access to broadband? And the second question is for Nitin. Can you talk about how some of the lessons learned or the toolkits you guys have acquired in providing internet for 4 million websites and the infrastructure you've obviously had to manage has implications towards access to broadband for communities? Either one first.
Ellie, you want to start? And then we'll go to Nitin.
Okay, well, the HHI is just an index done by some economists by the name of Hirschman and Herfindahl, if you need to know. But it really doesn't make much difference. It's a bit like Fahrenheit and Celsius. If the number is high, you have a high concentration. If the number is low, you have low concentration. And so basically, it's the square of the market shares, basically. So a high number in, let's say you got, let's say the ISPs in South Africa is close to 10,000 or whatever, kind of a very large number, and in the United States it's more like 1,500 or 2,000.
The short version, David, is that Ellie's sort of, in a lot of his research, has looked across lots of the communications and media industries, looking at concentration levels. And, you know, notwithstanding a lot of the domestic debate, right, based upon Ellie's work, the U.S. broadband market is less concentrated than most other markets?
Then, let's say yes. There are a few like France and so on that are, which is kind of always said, for example, but France is not for example. France?
Mike.
France is somewhat lower, including in the infrastructure side. Japan is relatively low, but not on the infrastructure side when it is very highly concentrated, but on the access type, unbundled type stuff.
Can I just add part of that, almost all of it relates to the fact that the United States, number one, had the benefit of having cable earlier, and therefore had two pipes in the home earlier, and therefore when satellite television developed, cable was already well entrenched. And so when we did the National Broadband Plan, we were criticized by some for not adopting a European, there was a big report that said, you know, we should have adopted the kind of European unbundling model. that completely ignore the fact that we have a different market structure than Europe. And the second thing, and there are a lot of different folks who deserve credit for this, is on the wireless side, we've kept a competitive market structure, and I think that the, you know, it's not as big a decision as breaking up AT&T, which I regard as one of the great decisions ever by government, but blocking the AT&T T-Mobile deal was a very good decision, and not an inevitable one. So I think there are some government policies that deserve credit for that.
But a word of caution, you need to be careful of the context in which you're asking the question. If you talk about broadband providers at 10 megabits, you'll have more competitors doing that. But when you start to talk about a high-capacity broadband, the number will shrink very significantly. So you need to put the question that you're focusing on squarely before you to have meaningful results.
But just a factoid, I love, by the way, what Lee Rainey talked about this morning, instead of a think tank, a fact tank. But the average consumer IP traffic per capita per month, right, in the U.S. is second only to South Korea at about 48 gigabytes per month. So, you know, there's a big debate. I mean, and other countries, it drops off precipitously, and even though the HHI is lower in France, the per capita consumption in France is only about half of the U.S. consumption. So it's not, so you also have to take a look at the usage, which is all, and maybe Nitin, you can even talk about this because you actually see what usage is. But if you may want to respond to David's question, and then we're actually at the top of the hour, so the break is coming. So Nitin is going to have the last word. But if Kate can have the last word, but she.
I could go fast.
Oh, good. I want you. So you will have you should have the last word. So Nitin and then Kate.
So quickly, the question was about like what are some useful tools. One of the things anything is by no means unique to Cloudflare, but I feel as the engineer I have to make a software reference. So this is really unique to software. You take really hard problems and you make the marginal cost of delivering that zero. And I think that's what companies like Cloudflare do again and again. So take an initiative called Universal SSL. We worked with a number of partners to make it dead simple within and even automated to get an SSL certificate so that you can support encrypted traffic, and then just included it by default. Overnight, we doubled the number of SSL protected sites on the internet. And so you do this again and again, whether it's with sort of data centers or different services. And as you add more services, it helps that you have an install base, and so the delivery is easy. And sort of once your software is written, you don't need to sort of write it again. So product versus services. It helps if your service. It helps a bit that there's some paranoia from the fact that about 96% of our users pay us nothing, and yet we're sort of GAAP profitable. And the only way is if you're absolutely paranoid about your costs. And at the same time, even as we're building out this network, we're cognizant that there's going to be someone smarter, cheaper, who's going to do something far better. So yesterday we met with a company. I mean, there are companies that are doing interesting stuff at like mobile base stations, for example, or using VMs. That's going to look at what we're doing in the here and now by deploying in all of these cities and say, that's not very smart. You should have instead done VMs. And so pretty much everything we're doing now, there's probably a smarter, probably a cheaper way. And so we're both trying to go fast, but also be paranoid about like what can be done much better than that. In terms of sort of growth, where we're seeing growth, well, there's growth in attacks, and then there's growth in legitimate traffic, which are sort of different conversations. But sort of unsurprisingly, there's faster. I'm sure we can put out sort of more granular data, but there's unsurprisingly like much faster growth in Asia than most other parts of the world. In Africa, we're still sort of early in terms of sort of seeing that because our presence is still growing, but we're turning up Djibouti, we're turning up Luanda. Well, Luanda is now live, and so we're excited to report back on sort of the growth that we will see.
So I'll just jump on that, and I think the question
Please.
was sort of like how, this is a topic that I find very interesting, of how, traditionally slow and annoying government is working with these fast, young, exciting, and hip Silicon Valley people. And one of the things that I think has been most interesting in the last year, and there's a couple projects that we're working on that we're not quite ready to announce yet, but where we've been trying to partner with some of this, we're agile, we're quick, we make decisions fast and move on them. And we're an institution that has an office in basically every country in the world, with a relationship with the governments of every country in the world, basically every country in the world. And we are in a situation where a lot of those relationships are in places where we can influence the ways that they're doing policy and regulation. And in a way that we're getting to the point where I think we know what those things are and those things that we want to encourage them to do. And what's been interesting is a couple of the private sector partners we've worked with, we've kind of said, jump on, we're ready to go. We've got X countries ready to make the changes that you're asking for and to put the policies in place. And they sort of sit back and go, oh, well, suddenly we need to have there be a market-driven solution. This needs to work for our bottom line. Oh, it's sort of like, we're kind of, there's a couple places where we're saying, government's ready to go. We're hiring better people. We're hiring more technologically focused people. We're training foreign service officers on digital economy. We're, hiring and training commerce officers on digital economy. And I think that we're going to start seeing in the next couple of years a situation where in a lot of embassies we're in a place where some of the major players might not be ready to make the leap in the way that maybe we are or they're saying they are.
So government leading or clearing the way.
Some places, I'm not saying everywhere.
Yeah, but clearing,
There's some
clearing
bright
the way.
spots.
Yeah. So is there anything else that you want to leave us with as a last word wrap up?
No, I just, I think we're doing okay. I think there's.
I think so. With that,
give us more credit than we're.
Thank you very much. I want to thank a great panel.
Nicely done, both of you.